Hello Cybersecurity Skills class, and welcome to this next video lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about cybersecurity compliance tools and compliance frameworks. Let's talk a little bit first about compliance frameworks, and in particular we're interested in the legal and policy framework that prompts us to be concerned about cybersecurity compliance. So I asked you this week to read Executive Order 13636, as well as some information from the NIST framework. Now, if you took the Internet Law class, you'll know that Congress has been trying for a number of years to adopt some kind of comprehensive cybersecurity compliance scheme, but has not been successful in doing that, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime in the near future. So in the absence of congressional action, and not without some degree of controversy, President Obama issued an executive order, that's 13636, that outlines at least some kind of basic minimum recommended approaches to cybersecurity compliance for critical information infrastructure. And you'll see as you read through that order that the thing that's primarily recommended is the National Institute of Standards and Technology's cybersecurity framework. And we're going to talk in just a minute about what that framework looks like and what it contains. There are, in some specific regulated industries, some particular rules and guidance documents. We're not going to dive into them in detail in this class, but you ought to be aware of them. So for example, you're probably aware of HIPAA in the healthcare realm and high tech in the healthcare realm, and these are statutes which set up rules which provide for covered medical information, rules about privacy and security and disclosure, and they include cybersecurity rules. In the financial services industry, there are a couple of applicable areas you'd want to think about. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act has specific rules about cybersecurity and encryption of certain kind of data. The Securities and Exchange Commission has issued guidance documents that recommend what kinds of disclosures should be made in annual reports with respect to cybersecurity incidents, as well as recommendations for entities that are licensed and regulated by the SEC, such as broker-dealers. FINRA, another one of the major financial regulators, has issued guidance documents about cybersecurity as well. And there are some others, for example, at the state level in New York, there's some proposed regulations that actually are pretty strict and would cover quite a lot of financial service businesses, because so many of them are located in New York City. So just be aware that financial as well as healthcare is an area where there's some particular regulation. Also in the energy sector, the Department of Energy has issued guidance documents over the past year or so, which cover power plants and things like that. Again, these are guidance documents. They're not regulations, so there isn't a specific legal duty, but presumably these guidance documents set out at least some kind of minimum kind of duty of care or reasonableness duty. The Federal Trade Commission, as all of you know, is also actively engaged in enforcement in this area. The primary role so far of the FTC is to try to ensure that companies are following their own published privacy policies, and the FTC pursues claims like that under the general provisions of the FTC Act, and claiming that it's an unfair trade practice to not follow your own privacy policies. And you all are also all aware of state data breach notification laws. So pretty much every state in the United States has its own set of laws about who has to be notified and how they have to be notified and when they have to be notified in the event of a data breach. A handful of those provide a private cause of action. Most of them don't. It's a regulatory obligation, and it doesn't impose any cybersecurity requirement on the front end. It does provide that, or many of those statutes provide that you don't have to give notice if you've encrypted, so it encourages encryption, or at least some of those statutes encourage encryption, but there are notification statutes on the back end. So all of these things are potential drivers of cybersecurity compliance procedures and policies within an organization. These are all reasons. Certainly if you're one of the regulated industries in those particular sectors, you're going to have a particular reason. But even if you're not in one of those particular sectors, you're going to at least have some incentive to think about whether you might fall within the terms of the executive order, or whether you might be putting out a privacy policy that you have to comply with, or the cost of notifying in the event there's a breach. I think even more significantly, or at least as significant in terms of risk, is the risk of litigation in the event that there is a breach. And you all know, and we've had people talk about in class, the various kind of state and federal class action litigations brought by consumers for breach of credit card data, like the Target breach you've heard talked about a number of times in class, and so on. Now, it's an interesting kind of risk because a lot of these cases have been dismissed at the pleading stage for lack of standing, for lack of cognizable harm, because credit card consumers generally are reimbursed by the credit card company. We are seeing, I think, a bit of a trend, certainly in the Seventh Circuit. There is an important case that says that a consumer can have standing in this kind of case, and even just yesterday, in the P.F. Chang data breach, which had been dismissed by the trial court, the Seventh Circuit reinstated it. So, you're seeing some of these cases get reinstated. A lot of these cases, even if you have to get through litigating, at the pleading stage, and even if you succeed and then you get it goes up to the circuit and you succeed there's still an enormous amount of expense. And there's an enormous amount of sort of lack of clarity in the law. That lack of clarity creates a significant liability and a significant risk. Executives in organizations, as you heard Erez Lieberman, for example, talk about, are very, very concerned about this, because you've seen cases where people have, high-level executives have lost their jobs because of the bad publicity and the costs of data breaches. The bad publicity, by the way, is also a significant cost. If you're a publicly traded company, it can hit your stock value, and you can lose millions and millions of dollars of stock value in a day because of bad publicity. So all of these things, and really this threat of these kind of general regulatory or soft regulatory requirements, coupled with the mitigation costs, the business losses, stock market losses, and the potential threat of litigation, provide a really strong incentive for most organizations today to be thinking really seriously about cybersecurity compliance. So, what is a proper cybersecurity compliance program? I think one of the interesting things about this field is nobody really knows for sure, and it's going to vary potentially even significantly across different kinds of businesses. But there are some principles we can think about, some compliance principles we can think about that are common to compliance efforts that in many ways, as you think about them and as we look at them now, you'll see they're really kind of common sense. But what they do is they make the relevant people in an organization slow down and think carefully through these different elements, and to work carefully through a compliance program that is hopefully a little bit proactive and prophylactic rather than just reactive. Having said that, everyone you talk to in this field will say you can do all the proactive, prophylactic work that you can, but it doesn't mean you're ever going to have perfect security. As we've seen, the hackers are really good. So you not only need to try and prevent it, but you need to be ready to mitigate it, and when it happens, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so here's some information on the NIST framework, and I think you'll see as we look at this how it relates to some kind of general risk management principles that you might see in the broader risk management literature. So the NIST framework has what's called the framework core, which is the core ideas of what the framework is supposed to do, what it's supposed to cause an organization to think about. a kind of a philosophy behind the framework, and then some tools or some ways of implementing the framework. The NIST framework core is right here on the screen, and I think you can see it's relatively simple, and as I said, kind of common sense. If you look at the left side, the core lays out some functions that an organization ought to be involved in regularly with respect to cybersecurity. The second column would be categories of risk that as you work through the framework and the tool that I'll show you in a moment, you'd identify those categories of risk. Those categories get broken down in the next column into smaller subcategories. And then on the far right column, there are references that provide kind of industry standards for trying to secure and think about the risk related to these functions, categories, and subcategories. And the references will be things like an ISO, an Insurance Standards Organization standard, or COBIT, which is a standard that's widely used in the computer security industry. Different kinds of standards that are published that organizations would have access to, and that would then provide reference, that would kind of provide procedures, take this step, take that step, take this step. So that's the general framework. It's not rocket science, but what it really does is it forces an organization to work through these details, kind of like we did in that tabletop exercise in class, but at a level of a lot more granular detail. So here's what you might call sort of the NIST framework philosophy. And this graphic is from the framework document. And again, it's not really rocket science, but what it's suggesting, and I think one of the most significant things that it's suggesting, is that if you move up from the bottom, the implementation, you see that guy sort of plugging things into a rack server, right? And you move up to business processes, so kind of the line management conducting its business. I think traditionally people thought of computer security, certainly at the implementation level, maybe at the business process level, if the business was engaged in something where security seemed to be critical to the product or service that's being offered. But then above that, to the executive level, and this is really the cultural shift that you're seeing in the industry, and that the NIST framework is trying to promote, that cybersecurity is a C-suite, a CEO level suite, executive level issue. And certainly, as you heard, again, Erez Lieberman talk about, big sophisticated organizations are beginning to treat it that way. And so the idea is that cybersecurity ought to be elevated all the way up to the top of the company. It's not something that just gets hived off into the computer operational level, even though that's the most fundamental level where the day-to-day work happens. So here is an example of a page from the NIST framework tool. And if you actually go to the NIST website and you can download the whole packet, the whole framework, you'll see that the tool is huge. There's pages and pages and pages and pages of this kind of stuff. And so you can see this page just relates to one particular function, the identify function within the framework core. One particular category of managing certain assets, a few particular, 6 particular subcategories there, and on the right you can see all of the different standards that are listed as potentially being relevant and providing information about processes to secure these. So for example, like this one says one of the functions is to identify potential risks. The category here is asset management. What kind of devices, what kind of systems do you actually have? If you look at the subcategories, the first 2 subcategories are talking about inventory. So do you even know within the organization how many servers you have, what they have, how many desktops are there, how many laptops are out there, how many company-issued phones or smartphones are out there? Do you even have a record of all those things? And of course, I think if you're looking at this, you'd say, well, of course an organization does. But if you've ever been in any kind of sizable organization or even a small organization, I think you'll realize that pretty quickly this gets out of hand. And maybe there are records kind of scattered in various places. Maybe there's no central inventory. The point is, it makes an organization sit down and actually think, okay, we can't just have laptops and phones and other devices out there without knowing where they are, who's using them, and so on. That's just a basic first step. So you'll see if you look at the framework tool itself, there are pages of this. All this, it's called a tool. It's really nothing. It's not really a technological tool. It's a management tool. You can, on the NIST website, download the tool as a spreadsheet file, which is really interesting. So, if you're in an organization that might want to take the tool and apply it, you can take pieces of it or the whole thing if you want, put it in and dump it into a spreadsheet, and then kind of figure out ways to work through different assignments, how to check off when things are completed, and so on. So that's our kind of legal and policy background and the NIST framework, which is incorporated into or referenced in President Obama's executive order. Let's pivot now to some kind of broader risk management principles that people involved in the cybersecurity business on the risk management side often talk about. And I mentioned in class that I recently completed an industry cybersecurity certification, and I took a kind of basic level course in cybersecurity risk management through the SANS Institute, which I highly recommend. It was an online course. It's very, very expensive, but for a lot of people in the industry, they'll go through some of these courses, and it really provided some good basic information. And I'm going to give you some information that I learned in these next few slides from that course that, again, is not rocket science, but I think it really makes you sit down and think about how to make this flow logically and what an organization needs to do to manage this risk. So a lot of people in the cybersecurity industry, compliance industry, talk about the CIA Triad. Now, of course, this doesn't mean the Central Intelligence Organization. That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about is three things: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The CIA Triad is referred to kind of in the biz as the cornerstone of security. This, from an organizational perspective, is what the purpose of cybersecurity is. Of course, you're managing risk, but how are you managing risk, and what are you trying to do? Confidentiality. Access to data is provided only to those who need the data. Integrity. The data is accurate and correct. And availability. The data is available to those who need it when they need it. Now, if you look at these three things, you can, and kind of look at them together, you can see that they potentially can be in tension with each other. So look at confidentiality and availability. Access provided only to those who need it. You're going to have to put restrictions on access. Availability, data is available to those who need it when they need it. The restrictions can't exceed the principle of availability. Similarly with integrity, the data is accurate and correct. Confidentiality, you're only going to provide data to those who need it. That means some portions of some databases might not be available to some people, but if they're not, then the data might not be totally accurate and totally correct. So the security function can't override the essential business functions for which the data is being used. Otherwise, security is kind of putting the cart before the horse, and you might be perfectly secure but have no business. So you have to really think about how all these things work together. All right, we also talk about the AAA Triad. Here, we're talking about authentication, authorization, and accountability. So authentication, the user can prove who he or she is. Authorization is the level of authority, the level of information that the user can access. And accountability means that there's some record of what was accessed and by whom it was accessed. So you can see how these things kind of go together, and I think you can get at least the beginning of a sense of how they relate to the CIA Triad. And I'm going to show you one more triad, and then I'll show you how the three triads actually work together. So the last triad is the PPT triad. Here we have policy, procedure, and training. So policy, general statements of managerial intent. Our network will be secure from external intrusions. That would be a policy statement. Very broad, very general statement, and it states what the intent of management is. Procedure, the detailed steps to implement policy. So policy, our network will be secure from external intrusions. Procedure, we will implement firewalls, and we will inventory all devices. We will implement firewalls. We will ensure that there is antivirus software. Those specific bullet points or numbered points or whatever you want to call them under the policy are the procedure. And then you would have more detail about how you're going to ensure that this virus software gets pushed out to all desktops and so on. Training is obvious, right? Communicating the policies and communicating the procedures to users. So this brings us to the Triad of Triads. I love these kinds of diagrams. So the foundation is the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Built upon that foundation are these other two triads of the AAA Triad: authentication, authorization, and accountability, and policy, procedure, and training. Now notice there's something at the very center of this pyramid structure, this Triad of Triads, which is the principle of least privilege. The principle of least privilege you can think of as kind of the fundamental principle that guides all of these three triads. And that fundamental principle is the notion that everyone can do everything they need to do and nothing more. Everyone can do everything they need to do and nothing more. So if you think about that phrase, I think you'll see how it relates to the ways in which we have to relate the different aspects of the CIA Triad to each other. They relate to what the AAA Triad is trying to do, and they relate to the kinds of things that have to be implemented under the PPT Triad. All right, another set of principles. We've kind of set out sort of broad policy principles. Now we want to talk about what do we do specifically with respect to particular cybersecurity risks that we've identified. So as we look through the Triad of Triads, we said, one policy statement might be the network will be secured against external threats, external intrusions. Well, what are some principles that we might implement concerning that? And this is the PDR Triad of prevent, detect, and respond. And I think you'll see these principles, relate very much to the NIST framework. The NIST framework maybe puts a little more meat on these bones, but these general risk management principles are certainly incorporated and brought into the NIST framework. And you'll also see, I think, these are not specific to cybersecurity. I mean, these are general risk management principles that can be applied across kind of any spectrum of risk. Think about it. You're facing any kind of risk. You want to try and prevent the risk from occurring. If it does occur, you want to detect it, that it occurred. And if you do detect that it occurred, you want to respond to it. All right, so prevent. You want to prevent what can be prevented. Of course, not everything can be prevented. Risk management is not absolute risk mitigation. It's called risk management. It's called management because, for a wide spectrum of risks, the best you can do is try to manage them. You can't totally prevent them. There's just risk in this world, and if you're going to be out there doing anything and doing business, unless you're just going to totally shut down, you're going to face risk. So you want to prevent what can be prevented. You want to detect everything else, and the important thing here is everything, right? Prevent what can be prevented. Ideally, you want to detect everything else, any risk that is realized. You don't want it to go undetected. Now, this doesn't mean that it's true that everything can be detected, but the ideal, right, is to detect everything else and then respond to anything that is detected. So anything that is detected must be responded to in some way. Now, again, respond doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to totally repair or make up for the risk, or totally recover from the risk. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but there has to be some kind of response. And critically for our discussion of risk management, there has to be some kind of plan for the response. So here are some principles that relate to these 3 points. Not everything can be prevented. You must try to detect everything. And then this last phrase that I learned in my training I really like: detection without response is useless. Detection without response is useless. If you might have a way of kind of logging and detecting when there are risks that have been realized. But if all you're doing is detecting and logging them, and you have no plan and no way of responding at all, then you haven't done anything. You've just wasted time. Okay, so how do we begin to think about making plans for kind of managing these risks, for deciding how and to what extent we're going to prevent things, what can be prevented, deciding how and to what extent we're going to respond? We have to engage in some kind of evaluation of the scope and the likelihood of a risk that might be occurring. And one way that we might think about doing this is in terms of putting some kind of valuation on the assets that are at risk, an identification of the threats to those assets, an assessment of the vulnerabilities that those assets are subject to, and that assessment includes figuring out what the probability or likelihood of loss is. Of course, we're rarely going to be able to precisely calculate the probability of a loss, but at least in some way, in some meaningful way, try to do that. And then you conduct what's called a gap analysis. Now, gap analysis sounds like one of those great business buzzwords, which it is. And again, it's a business buzzword that is really just common sense. What is a gap analysis? We're just looking at the difference between the level of risk, given the value of the assets, the identification of the threat, the likelihood of loss. That's our level of risk, and the level of protection. And what's the gap between those? Now, if there's no gap, well, then we have sort of the optimal level of protection. If there is a gap, then we don't have the optimal level of protection, and we have to decide whether we need to invest in more protection. Now, you all, as law students, some of you, maybe have worked in business or have had some experience in as a business major or in business school, and you're familiar with some of these. Maybe some of you aren't directly familiar with some of these ideas, but you all, having gone through the first year of law school and have taken torts, are familiar with this, because there is a classic example of how this works in the law of torts, which is the hand balancing test. And I'm sure you all remember this and savor the time that you learned this in torts. I always, when I teach torts, enjoy teaching this. So B, of course, is the burden of taking precautions. And on the other side, P is the probability of loss, and L is the scope of the loss. So you multiply the probability of loss times the scope of loss, and you decide whether that figure is greater or less than the burden of taking precautions. And if you decide that P times L is greater than the burden of taking precautions, then that suggests that there's a duty to take some precautions, right? If the burden is greater, that suggests that there's not a duty to take precautions. Now, as you recall from reading through tort cases that try to apply this formula, this is not an exact formula. Nobody, no judge in a tort case is literally having an actuary plug in numbers into this formula. It's a rough and ready kind of measure of risk management. Now, another thing that you ought to remember from torts and from looking at the hand balancing test is that risk management is always tied to the question of legal liability, because if you're not taking adequate precautions, then you may well be liable, for example, in negligence, and that the uncertainty always leads to the question of insurance. When we use the hand balancing formula, what are we really asking? We're really asking who has the responsibility to insure against the risk of loss. So, if the burden for the defendant, the allegedly negligent party, is lower than PL, which is really the cost to society, the cost to the injured person, then we say, well, then the potentially negligent party has the duty to insure, and that includes, taking steps to mitigate the risk and enacting, spending some money to enact precautions, and literally purchasing liability insurance often, so that if the risk is realized, there's some way of compensating. Alternatively, if the burden is higher, we might say, well, it's really not that actor's responsibility, it's society's responsibility to ensure, to bear the risk of loss. So the individual who might be injured, you might have to decide, do I want to engage in this activity, or if I do, I'm putting myself at some risk, or we might have a system of health insurance or other things like that. Obviously, those discussions get sort of very complex, and again, this is a rough measure of thinking about this. But what I do want you to know is all of these things that we're thinking about, particularly for us as lawyers, we ought to be thinking in terms of, well, all right, I'm managing risk within the background of facing some liability, and I want to think about how am I counseling my organization to ensure, whether it's precautions they have to take, whether it's literally looking into insurance markets. And as we've alluded to a couple of times, I think during this semester, there are developing insurance markets specifically for cyber risk insurance. Those markets are relatively young still, relatively untested still, but it's something you guys out there in practice dealing with these issues are going to be thinking about. Okay, so that's kind of how lawyers thinking about tort law, if you're using something like the hand balancing test, would think about doing some kind of really back of the envelope, very rough risk management calculation. How do professional risk managers do it? Well, they do it in a whole variety of ways, most of which are going to be more sophisticated than what I'm going to show you right now. But what I'm going to show you right now is kind of a recognized basic way of doing risk management calculations, quantitative calculations that go a bit beyond the learned hand formula. So here is the formula that I'm putting up on the screen for you, and here's what it means. ALE is annual loss expectancy. The annual loss expectancy, in other words, how much are you expecting the loss to be in any given year will be equal to the single loss expectancy. What do you expect a loss to be for any single event, times ARO, the annual rate of occurrence. How often do you expect this loss to occur in a given year? So, these are some nice kind of cool management-y sounding formula. Again, if you look at it, it kind of breaks down. It really makes sense, right? What's going to cost you for a whole year? Don't get caught up right now on whether it's a calendar year or a fiscal year. It doesn't really matter for this purpose, right? What's it going to cost for a whole year? Well, what does any one incident cost? Maybe I'll be able to quantify that. And how many times do I expect the incident to occur in a year? Maybe I'll be able to quantify that. Okay. So how do we quantify what the single loss expectancy is? Well, we really have to know what the value is of the asset that's at risk. Now that should be relatively self-explanatory. I mean, if we've got some customer data that provides information that enables us to compete in the marketplace and price our product to our customer, that's going to be an asset, and that asset's going to have a certain value. And that value might be, what's the kind of marginal benefit having that customer information gives us over our competitors in, our pricing in the marketplace. Even more straightforward, you might say, all right, we've got, we're selling a commodity. We've got barrels of oil, right? Those barrels of oil today are worth X dollars on the commodity market. I mean, that's much more straightforward. But even as my example of the customer data suggests, it can be really hard to calculate this. So, I mean, even though this sounds kind of highly quantitative, asset values can be hard to calculate and figure out, especially when we're talking about data. So even when you're doing this on a quantitative basis, you're going to sort of often have to sort of do your best estimates, and there are best practices, and the people that do this for a living will know kind of the best accounting practices and so on for doing that. All right, the EF in this calculation is what's called exposure factor. The exposure factor is the percentage of the asset value that will be lost if the risk is realized. And that, of course, is going to range from 0 to 100%. So, I mean, it could be that the risk happens and it really doesn't have any impact on the asset value at all, and then it's 0, right? Could be that the risk happens and the asset is completely destroyed, right? So let's think about our barrels of oil. The risk is that there's a major fire and explosion at the plant, at the facility where the oil is being stored. If there's a major fire, all the oil will be burned up and destroyed. Exposure factor is 100%. Now, more likely, what we're thinking about, a risk we're thinking about is not a major fire that destroys the whole facility, but a fire that eventually gets contained, and that, let's say, destroys 50% of the facility, and 50% of our barrels of oil, right? So then our exposure factor would be 50%. We'd multiply the value of the oil. Let's say the oil's worth $1 million. Our exposure factor is the risk we're facing is a fire that would destroy half of our barrels of oil. So then, our SLE is going to be $500,000. All right, the other piece in this calculation is the annual rate of occurrence. What is the annual rate of occurrence? It's going to be some kind of multiplier. So, example, if it's going to likely happen the risk is likely to be realized once a year, our multiplier is 1. If our risk is likely to be realized twice a year, it's 2, and so on, right? If the risk is likely to be realized every other year, well, then it's 1/2 each given year, so it's 0.5, right? If it's likely to be realized once every 25 years, 0.04, right? You can see how this math works out. And you really, if you're trying to do this kind of thing in a basic risk management setting, it doesn't have to get very much more granular than this. Again, it's quantitative, but it's pretty rare that you're going to have the kind of granular level data that are going to allow you to predict, this is going to happen, 13 times this year. It's just, that's highly unlikely. You're probably going to have to round off, 1, 5, 10, 2, every other year, every 5 years, every 10 years, and that'll give you kind of rounder numbers. Okay, so let's work through a specific example with these figures. So this is a very unrealistic example, but it's kind of straightforward, so it shows you how you would work this out. So let's say we have a building that's valued at $100,000. Let's say a fire would damage the building, would damage 25% of the building. And let's say that we have some insurance data, underwriting data that suggests a fire of this sort is likely to occur once every 10 years. So what we have here, we'd have our single loss expectancy. Our asset value is $100,000. Our exposure factor is 25%, so it would damage 25% of the building. And so our SLE is $25,000. Then we factor our ALE, right? We have our SLE is $25,000. Our ARO, annual rate of occurrence, is going to be 0.1 because it's a tenth once every 10 years. And so therefore, we're going to have a ALE of $2,500. Okay, so what does that mean if we have an ALE of $2,500? I mean, you could say, all right, that means I should spend about $2,500 on fire suppression technology. That's $2,500 is the ALE. That means in any given year, that's my sort of possible exposure. And so if I'm spending $2,500 a year on that technology, then over the course of 10 years, I'll have spent the total amount of the potential loss, and I'll have evened out my risk. So you could say that, and that is what this kind of quantitative calculation, in a sense, is designed to do. It's designed to tell you how much you should spend on mitigation, on risk management. But you do have to realize that this whole thing is not usually going to be precise. It's usually going to be unrealistic. So think, for example, about the asset value. Right, our asset value of the building, $100,000. If I sold this building tomorrow, I could sell it for $100,000. Okay, but if there's a fire, I may lose. There may be employees who are injured or killed. How am I going to value that? If you have to put money value on that, you sort of can. I mean, there are actuarial ways of doing that. And then, of course, there's value on that goes way beyond money, right? So we say 25% of the building, but are different parts of the building potentially more valuable than others? I mean, is there a manufacturing equipment that's really expensive to replace as opposed to a warehousing area with goods that I would lose that are easier to replace? What about opportunity costs? What about downtime? I mean, if the production equipment is destroyed, if that portion of the building is destroyed, does that mean that I'm out of business for a period of time? All those things, if you really, really wanted to dig into the granular level, you'd have to include in your spreadsheet. Now, there are people that do this kind of thing, right, that really crunch these kind of numbers and that try to do this, and there even at higher levels, there are ways of using big data to try and do this. But that's not what we're trying to do for our purpose right now in this course, or to introduce these general principles. And it's not necessarily what you need to do, kind of at the level of being a general counsel or an outside counsel in a business talking about cybersecurity and kind of introducing some of these principles. You're trying to begin to get the general sense, so at least you can put some numbers on things. All right, so that's a way of thinking about quantitative risk assessment. What about qualitative risk assessment? Exactly because it's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify every variable, it's also very useful to use qualitative methods of risk management. So here's a way of doing that that's in the literature, and that was in the training course that I took that I think is really helpful for you to think about. So what you want to do is you want to gather together relevant subject matter experts, and kind of in the lingo, SMEs, right? They love acronyms in this field. Maybe because it seems like a lot of people who are involved in this field are kind of ex-military people or ex-government people, so maybe that's why they love the acronyms. So SMEs, and present scenarios to them, kind of like the tabletop, and have them give their opinions about the severity and likelihood of various risk events occurring, and that will give you some kind of gauge of how to prioritize risk management. So how would you do that? Well, it's useful to have some kind of tool that might help you do that, and here's a way in this field that it often is done. So you can, on the one side, you can sort of put together a grid like this. On the one side, you have the subject matter expert rank the likelihood of a particular risk being realized. And you can use any scale you want. This example uses a scale of 1 to 5, right? So 1 on the bottom, 5 on the top. And it's really just an opinion, right? So you're asking this, maybe the subject matter expert is someone in the Chief Information Security Officer's office. Maybe it's the CISO, him or herself, or somebody in their office, okay? What's the likelihood of a virus infecting our system? Well, the likelihood is really high, it's a 4, or it's really high, it's a 5. Or it's low, it's a 2, right? So it's just an opinion. Then on the bottom, you can see is the severity or impact of a given event occurring, again, on a scale of 1 to 5. And then what you would do is you'd say, all right, let's say that the likelihood was ranked as a 4 and the severity was ranked as a 3. Then you would have a total score of 7. You can see in this particular tool, I color-coded it. That can be useful, right? So you see the 7 is kind of yellow, danger, right? But it's not red yet, but it's yellow. All right, so that's just a way of doing it. Now, what about the far right side, kind of bright red? And you'll see those numbers are in the 90s. And then on the severity impact level, you can see there's an extra box that's number 90, and under that says CMF. CMF means critical mission failure. 90 is just an arbitrary high number. I mean, you could put 100 in there, you could put 1,000 in there, it doesn't really matter. The idea here is that if any of the SMEs say, well, if this particular risk were realized, our business basically would crash and burn, then I'm going to rank that a 90 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is, right? So anything that's in that column is going to be critical mission failure. Now, as we're kind of going through doing this with your subject matter experts, you're going to end up with scores, average scores, for various kinds of risk. And if you do have anything that ends up falling into the CMF category, the critical mission factor category, then that's almost certainly something that has to be immediately and rapidly addressed. Even higher than something that's a 10. A 10 is pretty high. It's in a maroon kind of category on my chart here, right? That's a serious risk. It's going to rank higher than an 8 or a 6 or a 4 or a 2, and that means in all likelihood it's something that's going to have to be addressed sooner and with more resources than those other things. But even with that, if it's in the 90s, it's absolutely critical that it immediately be addressed. So I think you can see, how a tool like this could be usefully used. Now, here's just a little example. This is completely made up, just to show you how it might work. So, let's say you gathered 5 subject matter experts. I didn't identify who they are here. In the final problem, if you do the PowerPoint, you'll see that I include some information about particular subject matter experts. And let's say here are the numbers. So again, what you're doing is you're asking each one, and I have here some general categories. A virus versus the threat of hacktivism affecting, our company's websites and so on. Each expert will rank likelihood and severity. It's not unusual that different subject matter experts from different areas of the enterprise might give, differing assessments. You're going to go down and average all of those, and you'll end up with a total average from all of your experts. So you can see here that for the virus, the total average across your experts is 8.2. You round it off, 8, right? For hacktivism, it's 4.8 or 5. You could then go to the chart and kind of illustrate. All right, an 8, we're kind of in the yellow zone. That's it's not quite in the maroon zone. It's not in the CMF zone, but it's important. And 5, we're kind of in the orange zone. It's something we're going to need to address. But given that we have limited resources and limited time, we probably want to put more time and resources up front into virus prevention and detection and mitigation than into concerns about hacktivism. It's not that we're going to ignore hacktivism, right? But you can see it's a way of qualitatively ranking risk. You can do this kind of thing in conjunction with quantitative and run tabletops, which help identify some of the stuff that might filter into these sorts of tools. And then you're beginning to not just kind of brainstorm and make stuff up. You're beginning to put some real meat on the bones, some, even though they're kind of made up numbers in a sense, but at least some rankings and prioritization and some more thoughtful, thought out efforts at management. And the more thoughtful and thought out efforts there are at managing these kinds of risks, then on the back end, on the stuff that concerns us as on the legal side of the organization, the less likely and the less substantial our legal exposure is likely to be. Now, one other thing I want to note about this before we wrap up this lecture, this example that I gave you, you can see that both in likelihood and severity, the numbers are relatively similar across the different subject matter experts. What do you do if, one of the subject matter experts seems to be totally giving a different evaluation than the others? So let's say, for example, that you've got 4 subject matter experts who are in, risk management, legal, CISO's office, and they're all giving a relatively high likelihood and relatively high severity for a virus. Then you've got someone in sales, and the person in sales is giving a 2 for likelihood and severity. And that's an outlier, right? So in statistical terms, if you're familiar with that, it's potentially an outlier. And that means that skewed number, whether it's very much lower than the rest or very much higher than the rest, might distort the overall average. So you want to think about, if you do see that kind of skewed number, what does the result look like with that number included? What does the result look like with that number not included? Are there some explanations you might give for why it's an outlier? I use sales as an example on purpose because, salespeople tend to, be sort of accepting of lots of kinds of risks or not evaluate risks as highly maybe as, lawyers and computer techies and so on, right? So that's not uncommon. And so you might say, well, if I exclude this one, results in a much higher priority, and you might have some reasons to exclude it. All right, so think about that. Last piece of all of this, the final decision concerning what needs to be done and what ought to be done resides with senior management. Very often, much of the time, as the lawyer in this kind of role, you're not making the final decision. or if you're in compliance or risk management, you're not making the final decision, you're making recommendations. And this ties into the philosophy of the NIST framework, right? The recommendations for cybersecurity risks ultimately ought to go up to the C-suite. And, at the highest levels of the organization, then, taking into account all of their risks and plans and goals and resources, they need to make decisions about, what kind of protection, what kind of detection, and what kind of response they need to be involved in. This is the end of the lecture.